comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 4, verses 1 to 16. Now, the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next, she bore his brother, Abel. Now, Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, Let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where's your brother Abel? And he said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it'll no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you've driven me away from the soil. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said, Not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The word of the Lord. This sermon is called In the Beginning of Murder. You may have noticed a pattern in my sermon titles of late, because every story in the beginning of Genesis is, appropriately enough, a Genesis. It's a book full of these Genesises, and they're kind of nested like these Russian dolls. So in the beginning, you see God create the heavens and the earth. And everything that exists, everything in space and time, comes into existence. And within that creation, then God creates Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve, they have their own adventure within the garden that God created. And so we crack open the garden, and there's Adam and Eve, and within that, there is this story, our story. Adam and Eve sin, and they introduce the world to sin. They create a genesis of the fallen world. And that introduces where we are now. There's been a curse that's been put on the ground, and we have to enter in and deal with Cain and Abel. And when we do, it's going to set up something else. Inside the world of Cain and Abel, inside the world of murder, where grave sins happen, eventually God's going to say, well, enough of that. I've got to wipe it away. I've got to wash it clean. I'll put this one back here. But there's a problem. There's a problem to making sense of that, I think, if we're honest, because I've been encouraging you to look at these stories through the lens of mythology. To look at them not as falsehoods, not as made-up stories, but as true myths, as things which are accurate but which occupy the literary genre of a myth. And so have a lot of things in common with the Norse and the Greek myths that you've otherwise heard, with the exception being that they're true and they're accurate and they're from a worldview that is of God. And I think that when we talk about Noah, and when we talk about Adam and Eve, and when we talk about even the creation, we have an easy time relating to that. I mean, if we're making a pile of Bible stories and we pay attention to like the scope and the time and the stakes at hand with Noah and the ark, or with creation, or with Adam and Eve, we can see how those are grand stories. Those are a different kind of story than something like David and Goliath, right? Which takes place more on a national level in a particular time on one day, right? And we can kind of see how, oh yeah, Noah's Ark and Adam and Eve, those are similar types of stories. But Cain and Abel, it just feels a little bit personal. It's the story of two brothers that hate each other. Does anybody know brothers? Anybody had a brother? Known a brother? Met a brother? And in a lot of ways, those stories, the story of Cain and Abel seems to fit very much in line with Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau. Right? These stories of rival brothers. In fact, even, I would plunk into the brother stories category the story of the prodigal son and the elder son. These seem to have more in common. And indeed they do, because they exist in the world of Cain and Abel. Genesis opens up this world in which sin has grave consequences, in which immorality leads towards hurting people, killing people. And God shows proclivity for the young, weak son. And that theme carries through the Bible. God is consistently choosing weak sons and weirdos. But if we want to see what Genesis is doing, what Genesis 1 through 11 is doing with this story, we have to look at it in a different way. If we want to see the way it sets up Noah and the way it leads in from Adam and Eve, it's worth taking a look at the brothers of myth, the brothers from beyond the Bible, and seeing what cues they have to give us. Because brothers, just like origin stories and just like flood myths, are huge in that genre of literature. You may have heard of the stories of Romulus and Remus. Romulus killed his brother Remus, and good for him. He got to found the city of Rome that way. No one wants to be emperor of Rome. Or you might have heard of the brothers Thor and Loki, the strong but a little bit dim-witted God with the hammer, the God of thunder, and that God of mischief that were always at each other's throats. Throughout human history, people who've never read the Bible, some people who lived even thousands of years before the writing of the Bible, have told these sorts of stories. Because they resonate. Because there's something in them that's true, and we're trying to get at it. We're trying to figure out the right version of the story that plays the right notes on our heart. And it has something to do with this. There's a bad twin and there's a good twin. There's a dark side and a light side, but they're together. They're family. And they do stuff. And they hurt each other. When we close our eyes, we go to sleep at night, we dream of the fabric that the universe is made of. And so people that don't know each other tell the same sorts of stories. They tell these brother stories. I see it in our modern world. See these stories of these great rivalries, these sibling rivalries, and we get embroiled in them because they excite us, right? You for some reason feel strongly about stuff that doesn't matter, like Coke versus Pepsi. Anybody have a strong opinion about Coke versus Pepsi? In my house, we have a divided household with Coke versus Pepsi. Mac versus PC. Dare I say it? Dare I say it in this congregation? Knowles Gators? We tell these stories. And this story, this short, small, personal, relatable story, I believe, is at the heart of it all. I think this is the best version of the Mac versus PC story. This is the one that we would tell if we were inspired by God, the way the author of Genesis was inspired by God. And it goes like this. Cain and Abel bring an offering. And God chooses one of them. The whole sacrificial system is not introduced. It just kind of happens in the text. In the fullness of time, they decided it'd be a good idea to just bring an offering. And Cain, being a herdsman, Cain being a farmer, brings the stuff he farms. Abel, being a shepherd, brings a sheep, brings the stuff he herds. And in the ancient Near East, in the myths of Samaria and Mesopotamia, there was no greater rivalry. There was nothing more divisive that you could talk about if you wanted to make somebody angry at the local bar than the raging debate about shepherds versus farmers. It was kind of the modern version of hunters versus gatherers, right? But by the time we're ready for the ancient Near East, we've kind of put hunters versus gatherers aside, and the new high-tech version is shepherds v. farmers. And so there are stories, again in Mesopotamia, there's another one in Samaria, that feature a shepherd and a farmer, or a god of shepherding and a god of farming, and they are competing for the affections of the goddess. They want the goddess to marry them, and they're both trying to impress her. And it's not always clear. I mean, it's a rivalry, but it seems like the bias of the ancient Near East is towards farmers. I mean, shepherds, they get smelly. They're dealing with animals. There's blood and stuff involved, and it's just a bit messier. And besides, they wander around more. And so it's kind of more it's closer to that old-fashioned hunter or gatherer lifestyle. But agriculture, baby, that's the future. That's where it's at. Well, the real God chooses the shepherd. The God who exists liked Abel's offering more. And Christians have tried and tried and have made stuff up. And Jews, by the way, before Christians, to try to get a reason into this text. For why? Because the text doesn't give a reason. I mean, read the text, right? It just says God had regard for the offering of Cain and no regard for the offering of Abel. And then Cain asked, why? And I think a lot of us ask why. I think that's a reasonable question. I mean, Cain's not a very sympathetic character, considering later, but at that moment, there's a reason to ask, well, wait, I mean, that's who Cain is. He's a farmer. Aren't we supposed to bring God from what we are, from what we make, from our gifts and our talents? And Cain asks God, and God doesn't say any of the reasons that Christians have traditionally given. He doesn't say, I've seen your heart, Cain, and I'm concerned that you weren't giving the offering with a clear conscience. Or he doesn't say that, well, the thing is, Cain, that the ground was cursed in the previous chapter. You remember I said to Adam, and you weren't born yet, but that happened, and so, animals are better. He doesn't say, I know you've got murder in your heart. He doesn't say your offering just wasn't as good. That's one we like to make up. Right? It says in the text that Abel took the fat portions, and it just doesn't say anything about Cain's offering. So often we'll fill in the blank there, and we'll say, oh, Cain just gave leftovers. He ate his fruit first, and then he gave. One thing I've learned is that you can't improve the Bible. It doesn't work to put more in than what it says. And so when the text doesn't say something, it doesn't make it better. It sometimes makes it easier, but it doesn't make it more meaningful, more important, more beneficial to our spiritual life to just pencil something in. Nothing got left out. So what do we do with that tension? God just says, listen, I didn't like it. Sorry. There's no reason. I like that. Next time, do better. No big deal. I'm not punishing you. I'm not... Well, that's no fair, says Cain. I don't like that you don't like it. I'm going to do something different. And that's where murder comes from. That impulse. That's where evil in the world arrives. It's an interaction with and a rejection of God's arbitrary decision. God is an arbiter. God gets to arbitrate. And we don't always like it. I like the dirty, smelly, younger, smaller shepherd. That's who I am. I'm God. Well, God, I disagree. And I am bigger and stronger, and I can beat him. So that's what Cain does. And it's touchy. It's touchy in this modern world we live in to believe that. It's not cool to believe. It's not popular. That there are some beliefs, there are some practices, there are some ways of doing things that God does not like. And there are some people, some very nice people, some popular people who like those things. And the fact that those people like those things doesn't change God's opinion. God doesn't start liking those things because he loves those people. And it isn't fair. It's not. It's not equitable. Some people are born into Christian homes in the United States of America, and they are taught the gospel from an early age. Some people are born into radical Islamist homes, and they are taught a violent, distorted version of a corrupted gospel. And if they ever hear the true gospel, accepting it will mean death. That's not fair. And God says, I still want you to believe. That's what I want. Some people meet the love of their life at an early age. They don't have to look. He's right there. She's right there. Some people are attracted only to members of the same sex. Members of the opposite sex is gross. God's word stays the same. Some people have a knack for compassion, for empathy, for understanding how other people feel, and some other people just can't understand it. They can't get outside their own minds. They weren't born with that instinct. And it's much harder for that second group of people to love their neighbor, but God still wants them to love their neighbor. Some people have chronic depression, and they can't even love themselves. And God is with, and God loves, and God is in favor of all of those people. God wants relationship with them. He wants to work with them. He wants to sanctify them. He wants to bless them. But some of those people are going to have harder lives and different struggles than others of them. And it won't be fair. God is with Cain. God blesses Cain. God protects Cain even after Cain goes way beyond not giving the preferential offering to inventing fratricide. God protects, God gives grace for, God welcomes. But the ruling does stand. The truth of the world remains. And people have to choose either to follow God's ruling, which oftentimes hurts them, which often means a denial of some part of themselves, or to defy God's ruling, which hurts everyone. The message of this story, if I could boil it down in a single phrase, would be this: you worship God your way, and I'll worship him his. It says, don't follow your bliss. Don't do whatever you want. Don't try to do what this culture says, to just have high self-esteem and be yourself and say what you want and do what you feel and find a God, a church, a truth that suits you. It says instead, there are things that are consistent. You got to love your neighbor and you got to love yourself no matter how hard that is for you. And I want to help you to do that. You've got to exist in relationship with other people and with me, and you've got to follow. And there's a picture of how I have created the family to work. And for some of us, that's hard. Now I want to be clear. There is a lot of truth in the kind of cultural advice. There's reasons that the Zig Ziglars of the world and so on give that advice. The find your passion, figure out what makes you happy, you'll never work a day in your life. And it's because a lot of times that's true. That works, that makes sense. I mean, there are times that God has left a decision up to you, and you need to cultivate the skill of listening to your heart, of reading yourself and paying attention to your own needs and wants and values so that you can make good decisions at those times. That doesn't get invalidated by Cain and Abel, but we struggle with Cain and Abel because there are other times. There are times God has not left the decision up to you. And even if you were born this way, and even if you're predisposed to something different, it doesn't matter. We're called, all of us are called, to read our Bibles and pray and study at home. And some of us have been doing that as a daily discipline since childhood. We don't even think about it. We can't imagine a day where we wouldn't do it. And some of us in this room can try it for the first time tonight. All of us, all Christians, are called to love the poor, the economically poor and the downtrodden, the people who have less than you. And in order to love them, you have to know them. And you have to know them truly and deeply. You have to care about them, and that means being in relationship with them. And some of you in this room are poor. And that makes it easier to love the poor. All of you, all Christians, are called to evangelize, to share the good news of Jesus Christ with every tribe, tongue, and nation. And some of you in this room have the gift of evangelism. You're given a supernatural gift by God, and that makes you really good at it. And it comes easy to you, and it's not as scary. And the rest of you have to do it anyway. I never wanted to be a pastor. I told you that a couple weeks ago. I saw firsthand in my father the beating that pastors took, socially, financially, spiritually, and James chapter 3, verse 1 says, you shouldn't become a teacher of the law. Teachers of the law are judged more harshly. I believe that. But then I was called. God came into my life and said, Ryan, this is what you're going to do. And the fact that I would have rather been an IT guy, the fact that I would rather be an IT guy, it didn't matter. Well, it didn't matter to God. It mattered to me. And for years, I wrote a blog about my process in ministry because it took years. And that blog was called Fear of Whales. It's a Jonah reference. It's the story of a prophet like Jonah who has the benefit of having read Jonah first. It's the story of the steps I took, and sometimes the missteps I took towards God's call and away from my way, which wouldn't have worked. And whenever I took steps away, it did not work, let me tell you. And I don't say that. I don't tell you about that part of me. I should mention this. I've enjoyed a lot of aspects of ministry. I didn't want to go to Kansas. I mean, I was a beach kid. I was from Florida and then from California. And God said Kansas. And that's not who I was. I have in my notes that I can make jokes about Kansas because Tiffany's not here, but she came back from the nursery. But God led me there, and I followed. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you don't do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, and you must master it. Kansas was great. I loved it there, and I grew to love the people, just as I'm starting to grow to love all of you. I'm just thankful that I can love all of you in like the greater Disney World area instead of the cornfield that's featured on the front of your bulletin. And I don't tell you about that aspect of my life, that place where God said something different from me to impress you or to show you that I'm so awesome that I can listen to God. I do that because my Lord taught me how to do that. Because Jesus Christ entered into the narrative of human history, and what opened up in Cain and Abel and continued throughout the Hebrew Bible, of people disobeying, people looking at God's divine judgment and saying, well, who are you to decide? I like it my way better. The people who sin, people who disobey, nations, groups who say, maybe I'll go after other gods. Maybe I can get a better deal across the street. Jesus was the one who came to the garden and who put an end to what began in Genesis when he said, Father, if this cup can pass from me, but not my will, but your will be done. And that's our call. C.S. Lewis said that in the end, when all is said and done, when God's divine arbitration, his judgment, is completed, there will only be two types of people. There will be those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. May you be in the earlier group. Amen.